We're
get that link for
we're
everybody.
live. All right. Good afternoon, or really good evening, everyone. And thank you for joining another edition of the Lived Black Experience Project, where we come to you with some sometimes hard or difficult topics, historically and current events. This evening, we're going to take a step back, but I think this topic this evening is so relevant in that nation as a nation we're having some very interesting conversations, some very interesting occurrences that are causing us to go back and look at what happened 200 years ago, or even further, as we're celebrating or acknowledging Black History Month, which I must say, Black history is America's
Yes.
history. And so I'm so excited this evening to welcome back Dr. Donald R. Guillory, Dr. Guillory, who is a history instructor at Arizona State University and doctoral student at the University of Mississippi, whose focus is on race, gender, and identity in the history of the United States and Latin America. Dr. Guillory is a graduate of Georgia Southern University, very close to my hometown, Savannah, Georgia. And he earned his Bachelor of Arts in International Studies and History and Master of Arts in History. After serving in the U.S. Army, Brother Donald attended Arizona State University, where he earned his master's degrees in education and liberal studies, focusing on the role that film and television play in shaping our perspectives about culture and gender. He is also the author of the Token Black Guide, which discusses and examines experiences and perspectives, both historical and personal, on race in America. His first novel, Bastards of the Bayou, a historical fiction, was published last year in March. And in February of last year, Brother Donald presented a TED Talk at the University of Mississippi entitled The Importance of the Narrative. And so we're just very happy to have Dr. Guillory here with us this evening, where our topic is about President Thomas Jefferson, the Declaration of Independence, and a very interesting fact that he was also a slaveholder. And so I'm wishing that Dr. Guillory this evening will probably, if any of you are from the South or have had instance to spend a significant part of the East Coast period, where you will meet a lot of Black Jeffersons out there. And perhaps we will learn why through Dr. Guillory's story this or presentation this evening. Dr. Guillory, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. Now,
And
again, I gotta stop. It's just Don Guillory right now. The doctorate is a year and a half away. I'll take it. I'll take it right now. But
we're giving it to you because you're doing the work and you're doing some awesome work. And so
thank
you have already earned it. So we're giving your props now. Thank you so much for
thank you.
being here. And I'll see you at the end, where I know we're going to have some very interesting questions to go along or to follow your presentation. So again, thank you. And the studio is yours.
Well, thank you. And of course, I want to thank everybody who is watching as well, watching on the live stream. I was asked to talk about the background of Thomas Jefferson as well as the Declaration of Independence. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to meld the two. because I think it's hard to separate the man from his creation. And because a lot of times when someone creates something, someone writes something, they put a lot of themselves into it. They get a lot of their experience put into those pages, or at least into whatever they happen to create if it isn't a written document. But Thomas Jefferson himself, sorry, there we go. Thomas Jefferson, we all know, is first Secretary of State for the United States, third U.S. president. But he's also the drafter of the Declaration of Independence. And this gentleman was the father of six, at least with his wife. And through DNA study, it was determined that he fathered at least six children with Sally Hemings, who was one of his enslaved workers, as well as the half sister of his wife. Now, of course, he was born. He's attributed to being born on April 13th of 1743. He was the third of about 10 children to Peter Jefferson and Jane Jefferson, a plantation holder. When his father died, roughly around when the time that Thomas Jefferson was around 14, he inherited 5,000 acres of land, and he was granted full authority of that land when he turned 21. But prior to turning 21, he went to the College of William and Mary at 16. And like a lot of people in their freshman year, he wasn't concentrating on his studies. He actually liked to party, dance, hang out, and enjoy himself way too much that first year. And fortunately for him, it served as a very pivotal moment in his life, because he realized that first year was a waste. He wasted too much time and too much money, or at least by his estimation, too much time and too much money, because he spent the rest of the time in college, or at least in his educational pursuits, 15 hours a day or more dedicated to studying. And for those of you who watch Hamilton, there's that repeating line about Alexander Hamilton in the play, where he's writing like he's running out of time. And I guess the way you could compare it is, you could talk about Thomas Jefferson. He was reading and studying like he was running out of time. He engaged in a variety of intellectual pursuits, things of religion, science, mathematics, philosophy, politics, anything that he could get his hands on, he tried to learn about. Now, after he graduated, he was admitted to the Virginia bar. He became a member of the Virginia House of Burgesses, which is, the equivalent to a state elected body, your state legislature. And while he was in the House of Burgesses, he represented the cases of 7 enslaved individuals, all men. And this is early on, he gets this exposure to the system of enslavement from the perspective of someone who is seeking their freedom. Now, the land that he inherited, he also inherited other property in the form of human beings. Over the time of his life, Thomas Jefferson owned over 600 people. Now, it's very important to notice that, or to note that and to talk about it, because he is representing people in this case, or at least in these early cases, talking about how they have a natural right to freedom, and pushing these ideas or concepts of natural law, and arguing that everyone has a right to his own person, and they can use their person at their own will, which seems very controversial and contradictory, because that's what it is. I mean, you're talking about a young man who has inherited a massive amount of land, a massive amount of human beings, and he's arguing for the freedom of 7 individuals. Now, the case itself gets shot down. The judge actually denies these members, these plaintiffs, their freedom. And Thomas, something that you really would kind of be proud to know about him, he actually helps these men escape. So he gives them the means to actually escape, since they couldn't do it through the legal route. Now, this first exposure to that, gives him at least a good idea of dealing with the British government, because due to the French and Indian War and the war debt that the British government is trying to claim from the colonists, people like Jefferson, the Sons of Liberty, start arguing about their own rights to freedom. And at the certain point when you have members of the colonial legislatures that are arguing that we need to have better representation, we need to have some representation abroad, we need to fight against the taxes that have been imposed against us, any of uh, the varying measures of abuse that the government has pushed upon us. We need to do something. And the ultimate culminating point, there's some debate about this, comes in the form of the coercive acts, or better known as the intolerable acts, in which the British are punishing Massachusetts for the Boston Tea Party, or the tea protests. So they enact these things known as the intolerable acts or coercive acts, and it involves several different pieces. One is they shut off the Boston Harbor. They also push the Quartering Act, which allows British military to actually go into your homes. And of course, this is way before you have the right to deny someone entry to your home without a warrant. The power is stripped from the government of Massachusetts. And another thing that is very interesting, and this is also coming from things like the Boston Massacre, British troops and British officials are protected against any capital offenses. So if they happen to kill someone in a protest, in a march, or anything like that, there is no enforcement or there's no punishment for anything that they have done. So being a colonist, even if you weren't in Massachusetts, the first thought you have is, if they could do it to Massachusetts, they can do it to all of us. So this starts to push people like Thomas Jefferson into this idea of, we need to have self-governance. We don't need to be a colony of the British any longer. And one of the other controversies that came with being a colonist was this understanding that all colonists are equal, or at least somewhat equal, to other colonists. So by punishing Massachusetts, there's that understanding that this can happen to Pennsylvania, it can happen to Virginia, you can strip our rights away. So they saw at least this tie-in with each other that needed to be understood, and need to understand exactly what the ramifications would be for the British if they were not stopped, if they were not stood up to. So you have rebellions that start taking place in 1775, or at least more formal rebellions that start taking place in 1775 to fight against the abuses of the British power. People like Thomas Jefferson are looking to the Enlightenment period to talk about what their rights are as human beings, not just as colonists, but as human beings. What exactly should they get out of this system? And if the system is not providing them what they need or what they feel they deserve, what course of action can they take? So he starts looking at any of the Enlightenment ideas that he had been reading in years previous, and of course, papers that are coming across the ocean from Europe, talking about things like natural rights, talking about social contract, talking about the co-equal branches of government, talking about very revolutionary ideas. And these are things from Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, Baron de Montesquieu, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. So you got British, you got German, you have French philosophers and I guess political theorists that are coming up with these different ways in which a government should work. Now, the Declaration of Independence itself raises a lot of questions. I mean, how are you going to get to this point? And I'll get to that in a minute. But when I'm talking about Jefferson, or at least this idea of understanding that Jefferson is the architect of this, there was a group of 5 individuals that were part of this. Most notably, it was John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin. And when they got together, the members decided Jefferson is the most equipped to spell this out. He's the best with words. He can actually spell it out for people to where he can get them fully involved and fully behind this movement. But before I jump into that, I need to show you this. So the crux of the Enlightenment period itself is all about how we're going to look at society, how are we going to remake society to where it's going to benefit more than those that are at the top? Now, this is not some very progressive or even in some cases an egalitarian thing where everyone is going to be equal. You have to come from a point of privilege to run in these circles, to talk to these people, to get these ideas going. And what these more educated individuals found was we should focus on some things like critical thinking, reason. We don't necessarily need to follow the Catholic Church, the Anglican Church. We can actually fix this system. We don't need to rely on an institution or an old institution like a church or the church to fix these things. We don't need to rely on the monarchy. We should be able to do this, not based off of how someone comes into this world, who they're born to, what family they're born into. So I'll skip past this as far as Hobbes, but the biggest thing I want anybody to understand about him is that Hobbes pushes this idea that there is this thing in society known as the social contract. Okay. Individuals that are in a society give up power or authority to a leader or to a body, a governing body. And whoever's in charge needs power to keep people under control. And the thing is, you can't have too much wiggle room, is at least some of the arguments that are coming out of it. But someone that Jefferson was a little bit more keyed into was John Locke. He argues that people can think for themselves, they can learn, they can get some different types of experiences, figure out how things work and how they can make things work better for themselves. But the greatest thing that he pushes is this. This is that idea that the natural right, the natural state of man, you are born free and equal. And at the bottom here, I've listed those three rights that he spells out in much of his philosophy: life, liberty, and property. Government cannot deny you those things without due process. So you cannot be executed unless you have gone through the proper court systems, judgments, anything like that, sentencing. And the same thing with liberty. Your property cannot be taken away from you without due process. So anything that is yours, your life, your freedom, the things that you own, they are yours by natural right. They cannot be denied to you arbitrarily by a government. Now, Locke also argues that when a government makes enough mistakes, when it involves people's rights, if we're not protecting your right to life, if we're not protecting your right to maintain your property or keep your property, or we are, arbitrarily throwing you into jail, or people are coming into your house without a warrant, then the people that are being governed have a right and all authority to overthrow their government in order to put in a government that is going to protect their rights. So the consent of the governed, the will of the people, all talks about this idea of, if we are citizens of this nation, of a residents of a state, if we're part of this thing, the government of that cannot run anything if we haven't given them the power to do so. And that in itself is what democracy is about. Now, the philosophers, those in the Enlightenment period, all believe in these various aspects, as far as reason, critical thinking, this idea of natural laws. Even this thing that comes up in the Declaration of Independence, or at least in the second draft of it, this idea of happiness, this pursuit of happiness, like seeking out improvement, and also seeking out the achievement of the rights that you have given the government the authority to protect. Now, another individual, and I skipped over Voltaire, no disrespect to Voltaire, but in order to get to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, because he starts to push and actually cements more of these issues. So it's not just the idea of, human beings, men are free and they are individuals, they have their rights, they have all these great things that make them human beings and free beings on this earth, he criticizes the way that governments work and the way in which some of these monarchies work to reduce the amount of freedom that you have. In his writings, and of course, there's not enough time to go into all the stuff that he has, basically says that the only thing that's going to work is a government that is governed by this thing known as the general will. And the general will is what you as human beings, as citizens have agreed to or agreed upon, is the type of system that you'll create. It's the type of system you're going to maintain. And it's the type of system that, in all honesty, should be the envy of other systems. And to break it down a little bit further, this is the way the social contract works. And this kind of differs from Thomas Hobbes when Jean-Jacques Rousseau starts criticizing it. Social contract exists between the governed and those who govern. So the people themselves give power to the government. The government's duty is to make sure the people's rights are protected, their safety, their security is protected as well. But if a government, and this is one of Rousseau's arguments, if the government itself abuses power or does not protect the citizenry, then the people have the right to get rid of that government. And there are various ways in which you can get rid of a government. Elections. Okay, you have overthrown. If you happen to be a colony, you seek your independence. Not every removal of government is going to be violent. Sometimes it is just a simple transition of power. Sometimes it is simply, we don't like you, we're going to have a recall, as you've seen in some elections. And of course, I think at the early part of the 21st century, what happened in California with Gray Davis, which then brought in Governor Schwarzenegger. It was the idea that this person is not doing what he needs to do or she needs to do for the people that they're governing, and we can remove them from power. The best thing is when any of these removals of power are peaceful transitions, and they are one of those things that go through the traditional ways in which we decide who is going to be anything from the mayor to a president. It's going to the ballot box because you did not like party A or person A, and you decide, now I'm going to go with person B or party B. Now, I brought all those things in about the Enlightenment to talk about this. The Enlightenment itself, those ideas of the natural rights of man, the idea of freedom, the idea of the structure of a government, all those things come into playing when these three men, those three of the five, decide to sit down and start talking about what should be in this document. How can we express our disgust, our outrage with the British government? So Thomas Jefferson relies heavily, as well as Franklin, as well as John Adams, rely heavily on that thought. And you see some of these things come up. So all men are created equal. All men are free and equal. The rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The rights of life, liberty, and property. There are some changes that take place, and these are essential changes and necessary changes in order to deal with the situation that they have at the time. Now, after drafting this, and there is a rough draft, which is somewhat different than the final draft. But the draft that becomes the declaration that we all know of is introduced on June 28th. There are debates between the members of the Continental Congress about whether or not they should go forward with it, what should be done. It's adopted on July 4th, but it's not signed until August 2nd. Now, a lot of great things happen at this time, where from July 4th, the announcements are made somewhat in a hurry that this document is now going to free us from the British. There's so much misinformation and so much, excitedness about what's going on that people start protesting British officials when they hear that this document has been adopted. A statue of George III is torn down Now, this declaration is just about seeking independence. Independence has not been achieved because in order for you to declare independence, your independence has to be recognized. And the British obviously are not going to recognize a colony of theirs as being independent at this moment. Their fear is, or at least among one of the many fears is, if the American colonies declare freedom or declare themselves independent, what does that mean for the rest of our colonies? So they're not going to look at this list of grievances and say, you're right, we've been a little bit rough, you guys can have at it, be on your own, enjoy yourselves. Because they're going to have to deal with the Caribbean. They're going to have to deal with South Asia. They're going to have to deal with the word of this spreading everywhere else in the world and having to deal with the fallout. Now, the greatest thing about the Declaration of Independence is that it defines, or at least changes the definition of what's taking place. So all these protests, all these boycotts that you saw, that you read about, that are over tea, over the Townsend Acts, over the sugar, the Stamp Act, all these different ways in which the British government is trying to exert their authority, but also trying to get some compensation for the French and Indian War. It now changes from, we have these colonists who are upset and angry and fighting, in the streets with some of our troops and upset about the way things are. It goes from rebellion to full-on revolution. You have defined the problem. You have defined the issue. And more importantly, you've now pointed out who the problem is. It's not me, it's you. Unlike a lot of breakups that some of us may have gone through. It's typically, hey, it's not you, it's me. The Declaration of Independence is basically stating, it ain't me. The fault is all on you. And it's laid out, and of course, I'm not going to read through the entire Declaration of Independence, but it's laid out very plainly and in very easy language to follow. I mean, there are a few terms that we don't necessarily use today, but the way it states out the problem that they have with the British Crown, the British Parliament is great in getting anyone who is now going to have access to copies of this, that they can read it, from their local print shop. They can get a copy of it. You can read it and have it disseminated. You can have it posted up on buildings, on churches, and people can read this and understand, I was feeling the same way, but I was afraid to say something. I was feeling the same way. And I'm glad I elected this guy to my local legislature. I'm glad we sent this person to the Continental Congress because I've been feeling that same way. And they lay it out right here. At least Thomas Jefferson lays it out right here. And you can see the 56 signatures. Can't make out all of them. The 56 signatures of the delegates that were there. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another. So I'm breaking up with you. Bye. Don't call me, write me, don't message me. I want nothing to do with you. And to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. It's not me, it's you, and here's why. So there's a long list of grievances that are thrown out, and a lot of them about the king, a lot of them about Parliament, a lot of them about uses that they have taken as colonists, British, or subjects of the British crown. And one of the best parts, and of course, in a lot of schools, you're supposed to recite either the opening or even this part, but we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal and they are endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights from birth, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, Governments are instituted among men, self-governance, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it. Social contract has been broken, and institute a new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. We're going to do what's best for us because you have not been doing what's best for us. You've been doing what's best for you. And in doing so, they are now staking out this claim that they are the ones. And they even go so far as to name who they are. We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America in General Congress assembled, appealing to the supreme judge of the world, God, for the rectitude of our intentions, due in the name and by authority of the good people of these colonies, self-governance, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states, they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and to do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. This is, by signing this, all 56 members are now taking an oath to this new nation, the United States. And they are then stating, you can come over here. We'll die fighting. And with this, and of course, for those who may be younger or too young to understand this part, my generation and older, we used to refer to whenever you were doing a signature as you would be putting your John Hancock on something. The members who were signing this understood what those words meant, especially that last part about pledging your life to this. John Hancock wanted no mistake as to who he was and who was making this signature on here. Now, this is also because John Hancock had, kind of I guess you could say a vested interest in becoming independent, because some of the ships, one of the ships, in fact, the Liberty, some of the ships that were confiscated by the British for smuggling was one of his ships. So the British were costing him money by running the colonies in the way that they were, with the higher taxation and the way in which they were clamping down on the ports. This is one of these moments where you look at it, you can make out some of the signatures. You can see Benjamin Franklin in there. You can see John Adams. You can even make out Thomas Jefferson a little bit right here. But it's very clear. You don't have to know who any of the rest of these people are. You know who this guy is. And he's doing it for even the people who don't know who he is, because you're going to see that large signature and you're quickly going to question, who's John Hancock and why did he write his name so big? Oh, this is out of defiance of us. He's trying to prove a point. He's trying to let us know something. Now, again, it was introduced on the 28th. It was signed August 2nd. It was agreed upon on July 4th. We use July 4th as that marker because that's when the agreement is, but none of these signatures itself were there, and the signatures themselves weren't all there until until August. But of those people who signed, 41 out of the 56 were slaveholders. 15 were not. These men were coming from different paths in life. You had men of science like Benjamin Franklin. You had planters. You have slaveholders. You had people who were in the military. you had military careers, you had merchants, you had a various walks of life for these people that are involved. Now, speaking of slaveholders, this is where we get into kind of, I guess, not necessarily murky water, but we start to look at what's going on here a little bit more carefully with the people who are signing this. So 41 out of 56 sign on to the Declaration of Independence. Those 41 had reservations about some of the stuff that Thomas Jefferson wanted to include. Now, mind you, Jefferson is one of those 41. And he stated that he wanted this in. This was part of the rough draft. And this is one of the complaints about the king. He has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. Speaking of the Middle Passage. So he carves out this piece when he's writing this draft, and he's saying, you forced slavery upon us. You made slaves, or at least made people become slaves, and kind of tied us to that system. But even more so, if that wasn't insulting enough, to go ahead and put all of North American slavery on the plate of George III, he goes even further. So, we're determined to keep an open market where men should be bought. You kept a market where men should be bought and sold. So he's saying that this conflicts with your religion. You're a Christian king, but you're saying we should have slavery, we should have slaves, we should buy and sell people. He has prostituted his negative for suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or restrain this exacerbable commerce. So basically stating that not only has George III engaged, and the crown itself has engaged in the transatlantic slave trade, as well as enslavement of people in North America and the continued enslavement of people in North America, as well as strengthening the laws that are going to keep slavery in North America and keep Black men and Black women as slaves in North America. He also stopped any attempt for any type of freedom for these Black men and women. So Thomas Jefferson has a little bit of, I guess he's still a little bit salty about the court cases he tried, because it was the king's authority that stopped this, because the judge was following the king's program, Parliament's program, when it came to slavery and enslavement. So again, he's a little salty still about that. Not only that, but when the rebellions are taking place in the Americas, in North America, the British proposed, well, if these guys keep up with all these antics, with all the stuff that they're doing, throwing tea into the harbor, beating up tax collectors, harassing and murdering, public officials, I'll just free the slaves and use them to fight you. So they took that as another thing. So you're only going to free them if you want to use them, us. So this was part of the rough draft, but members of that body, of that Continental Congress, were not vibing that well with this, so they made him cut it out. He couldn't have that in the rough draft, and then he tries again to include some things, but he can't do any of this because he's not going to get the support of those other men that are part of of this body. Now, when they're debating this, Thomas Jefferson himself is very angered at this idea and basically calling people that don't want to sign on to this is cowards. Now, he's not doing it outwardly. He's putting it into, his own argument and his own reflection of how he feels about this. The pusillanimous idea that we had friends in England worth keeping terms with still haunted the minds of many. For this reason, those passages which conveyed censure on the people of England were struck out, lest they should give them offense. So you made me cut this stuff out because it was going to be offensive to them. Are we breaking up with them or not? The cost to reprobating the enslaving of inhabitants of Africa was struck out in compliance to South Carolina and Georgia, who had never attempted to restrain the importation of slaves, and who, on the contrary, still wished to continue. Now, again, this is a little hypocritical because this man is a large property holder and a large slave holder. Our northern brethren also, I believe, felt a little tender under these censures. For though their people have very few slaves themselves, yet they had been pretty considerable carriers of them to others. He is doing what I would argue is a little bit of self-reflection and a little bit of deflection. He's saying we should do this. You guys have problems with this. Guys in the North have a problem with it. People in the South have a problem with it. But if we're not going to fix this situation, can we really argue that we're fighting for freedom? Can we really make that argument? Now, Jefferson himself, as well as other slaveholders in the United States, the now United States, are beholden to two principles. And whenever you're talking about slavery, the system of slavery, the economic system itself, or the control of human beings and all that's entailed with it, there are two schools that you can think about when it comes to owning slaves or enslaving people. There's the theory or the idea of paternalism, and paternalism is basically this: I have to take care of them. They can't take care of themselves. And using that argument to maintain the system of slavery. Now, a lot of people are making this argument. It's a very hollow, a very shallow one, because this is the one that really dictates why they're involved. Self-interest, money, power, political influence. That's what it really comes down to. It's removing the humanity of the individuals that you own, control, and force yourself on. It's making money from them, from whatever cash crops you have, or leasing them out, or leasing them for breeding rights, or the more wealth that I have from this system, the more land I can own, the more influence I can have with politics. And as the nation grows past these borders, as it grows, we eventually start to see how slavery itself is going to dictate congressional representation, how it is going to dictate presidential elections. The electoral college system is implemented at its root because of the system of slavery. And when we're talking about census itself, and this is getting ahead to the discussions of the Constitution that we'll be talking about in a couple of weeks, even when you're considering population sizes, these states argue that they should count slaves as people. These states argue that you shouldn't count them because you're saying that they're property. So we can't let you have a higher population. So are they people or they property? And for those of you who've studied a little bit of history, understand that they come up with a compromise stating that we will only count 3/5 of the slaves that we have in order to have representation. But people like Thomas Jefferson, he argues that he's somewhere involving both of these. He feels it's his responsibility, now that they're here, to take care of them. You know, he inherited the land, he inherited the slaves from his wife as well as from his father. So about 134, 135 from his wife, who was previously a widow. And then he inherited enslaved persons from his father when his father died when he was around 14. He sees it as his responsibility, but that doesn't stop him from treating them no differently than any other slave master would. and also the writings that he has about them. Now, a letter that he writes to Benjamin Banneker, the designer of Washington, D.C., and a freed African American, he argues, nobody wishes more than I do to see such proofs as you exhibit that nature is given to our black brethren, talents equal to those of other colors of men, and that the appearance of a want of them is owing merely to the degraded condition of their existence. So he admits to a black male, I know you guys have unlimited potential, but this whole slavery thing is what's stopping you. Meanwhile, he's got 600 enslaved people that he is the owner of. Now, Thomas Jefferson himself, as I said, he is a complicated figure. He owned over 600 slaves himself. But when we look at him, and we look at any historical figure for that matter, you have to look at them in the whole picture. We can hate the stuff that he did that was bad, and there's a lot of it. But we can also appreciate the other things that were done, like this document, and also some of the attempts that he did make to at least make some type of progress for the time, given the limits, given the constraints that he was under. But by no means should we forgive him for the bad because, we think some good outweighs the bad, or we see him as a complete monster because more bad outweighs the good. Human beings are complicated figures, and historical figures are probably the most complicated because so many times we find ourselves either wanting to have them live up to this iconic, mythic legend that has been created around them, or we have to, we overemphasize the reality. And the truth is, complicated figures like these people, we can judge them in the context of their time, but even in their own time, there were some thoughts, there were some behaviors, there were some beliefs that mirror the ones that we have. So with the Declaration of Independence and with Thomas Jefferson himself, as far as the writings that he drafted, you see how the document itself, just like the Constitution, are two timeless documents that you can look back on and see that the promise of them hasn't been completely fulfilled. And you see that these are documents that are not an end point. These are documents that are a starting point and a point of continuance for generations to come. So I've included this last piece to talk about the legacy of just the Declaration of Independence. And this quote I've included states, in a sense, we have come to our nation's capital to cash a check. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This was part of the speech that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. gave in 1963 in Washington, D.C. And he's talking about, and he's going back to these documents and talking about, we haven't necessarily achieved everything that's there, but we can look at it as kind of a guide to say, we need to get to that point and often do some self-reflection as a nation as a whole and realize where we are lacking, how we haven't gotten to those pieces, who's left out, who needs to be included, who we need to listen. And who's been rendered invisible in a lot of these discussions. Now, mind you, this is from 58 years ago. Well, it'll be 58 years this year. 58 years ago that this speech was given. And in 2008, then Senator candidate Barack Obama, and then the 44th president of the United States, Barack Obama, gave a speech in 2008 entitled A More Perfect Union, where he hearkened back to the language in the Declaration of Independence and talked about the ideas the people were promoting and people of that day. And in order to become that perfect union that those drafters of the Declaration of Independence, as well as the Constitution stated, what they, at least the end goal We haven't gotten there. We haven't gotten there since 1776. And we are in constant progress towards that moment. And the understanding is we can't stop moving forward. You can't go backwards, and you wouldn't want to go backwards. But the quest is now to go forward, knowing and with all the tools that you have at your disposal now, to get to the point where those words mean what they say. Because unfortunately, and this again goes with Thomas Jefferson, those words came into question just a few years after the United States actually has its independence. There is a revolution that takes place in the Caribbean. The founders of that revolution are using the same language of the philosophes, same language of the Enlightenment period, and the same language that you have in the Declaration of Independence. The Haitian Revolution itself is tipped off because of conditions with the French, but then also because of conditions that have taken place with the United States. And as a result, I'm skipping forward because of time. As a result, what you see is this massive shift throughout the Americas of revolutions that take place. And at the heart of many of these revolutions is the same revolutionary thought that you had in the United States that launched the Declaration of Independence, which then launched the Haitian Revolution, which then launched the Mexican Revolution, then launched revolutions throughout the rest of Central America and South America. Those words, all men are created equal, is not exclusive to the United States. And I think Thomas Jefferson understood that, because he didn't say all members of the United States are created equal, or all of the people in these colonies are created equal. He was calling on universal qualities that got brought up in the Enlightenment period to talk about the need for revolution. And because the United States had theirs, it was the catalyst for others, among other things. It wasn't the sole reason why Haiti becomes independent or why Mexico becomes independent, but the way in which the language gets used, the way it gets adopted, and the way that people start to realize that they have the right to self-determination. You have a revolutionary period throughout the 19th century that allows these men and women of these other nations to argue the same points. And we can make the same argument now in 2021 when it comes to appropriate representation or having your voice heard by your elected officials or in the ballot box or even on social media. It's very important for people to understand that they have a role and an active role within their society. And their responsibility is to voice their opinion, is to speak out for themselves as well as for others. And that is all I have. I need to get some water now.
Go ahead and catch your breath. Oh wow. There's so many questions, and so I do want to begin. I have to do this because I have such a heart for, I say IT. Many people say Haiti. That revolution is why very little people know about IT and why they are almost virtually invisible. And especially when, like in recent times, they've been in need. Was it last year or year before last, the last big storm that hit Haiti? And we did not give them any assistance.
And that's been our relationship with Haiti since since 1804. Well,
Mm-hmm.
actually before then, because I didn't have time to get into it, but the revolution in Haiti, um, Jefferson used as rationale to buy Louisiana, or at least one of the reasons to buy Louisiana, because he argued like, oh well, the French can't protect their slave can't control their slave populations, and this is just going to hurt us. So he wanted to buy New Orleans so he could actually, or at least so the U.S. military and U.S. Navy, the little one that we had at the time, could prevent any slave insurrections from spreading throughout the South, throughout the Gulf, and prevent any influence from the Haitians to hit New Orleans and then spread throughout the rest of Louisiana. But the combination of mosquitoes, Napoleon fighting and needing money, and Thomas Jefferson wanting New Orleans ended up getting all of Louisiana. But I guess it really doesn't matter for me because my family would have been there anyway, because they left Haiti and then went to Cuba and then went from Cuba to Haiti, but then I'm sorry, to New Orleans. But then I had some family that was already in Louisiana at the time. So I guess I would have been here either way.
How about that? And then you even ended up very close to Savannah, as many IT soldiers did
Yes.
in, what was it, October 1779, when they joined to run the British out of Savannah.
Well, you
So,
had that, and there was another one, because this gets into the other thing that we can definitely get on to Thomas Jefferson about, which is the exploitation of women of color, because there were quadroons that were brought in from Haiti, from New Orleans, and they were brought to places like Philadelphia to showcase the beauty of these women, these women and their skin color and their hair. Hey, you can have one. And for some of these women, it was further exploitation, but for some other women, it was a liberating thing, because there were some men that wanted to marry them. They couldn't
yeah,
legally, but they bought them to become free, and had they were known as plusage. It was a plusage system where
yeah,
they could come in and, I can be your wife, but I can't legally be your wife. So they
right.
had children allowed to inherit property, and you had this in places like Philadelphia. In New Orleans, it was a little bit more strict, where you had the planters had their white wives, but then they had their Creole wives or their quadroon wives in New Orleans. And that'll be another book at another time, because the stuff I found out
I'll,
last year blew my
I will be
blew my mind.
looking for. I will be looking forward to that. That topic comes up quite frequently in Savannah,
Mhm.
and Savannah and New Orleans share a sort of very familiar stories. But I want us to get to this fight for freedom.
Yes.
And we have a question up here. Was the fight really about freedom, or was it really about money?
Ooh, you're gonna get me in trouble. Which means
That's
I'm
why
about to
we
be honest.
do
All
this
right.
broadcast.
Here is the problem with the way it is taught in American schools. And I'm saying this as a former high school teacher. The way it is taught in schools is, it was all about freedom. And then there would be the smart aleck kid like me in the back when I was going to school saying like, freedom, then why didn't they free those other people? It was about a place of privilege. And for a lot of people, and I'm going to pick on John Hancock here, because he was losing so much money because of the restrictions that the British were putting there. That was one of the reasons why he wanted to show them like, haha, I'm going to get paid now. Like, I'm going to bring in goods. I'm going to get paid. Now we cut you out. The middleman is gone. For some of these men, it definitely was about freedom, because they didn't like the idea that they didn't appropriate representation, or they didn't have a say within British Parliament. Now, there's some theories about the whole taxation without representation, which goes to the comparison between Americans American colonists and Indians who were being colonized. And the idea was, when they first had a grievance with the British, they wanted to have representation in the House of Parliament, but Parliament rejected it because the statement that you were just colonists. And basically, if we let you colonists have rights, we have to let them have rights, and we're not letting the brown ones have rights. So there was a racial factor that was thrown into it as well. So some saw it as, if you are going to treat us like the Indians, we can't tolerate that. I do want to have my own semblance of, I have a friend who's a Benjamin Franklin scholar, so I'm not going to say anything Benjamin Franklin did because I want to get it wrong. But there were people like Benjamin Franklin who saw that, who fully agreed, because he wasn't a slave owner, who fully agreed with this idea of freedom itself. And this idea that we're educated, we're men of means, you know, we should be able to do this. And I'm not a religious guy, so why am I worried about the Church of England and the king being the head of the Church of England? Like, I really shouldn't be dictated by that. It's no different than I don't want the Pope telling me what to do. So there were some things where, you know, the concept of reason and non-religion, not necessarily anti-religion, but non-religion was brought in. You also have this idea of moving forward with scientific reasoning, as well as, you know, they're forming their own culture at this point, because you have the trade routes between the colonies themselves, where just like we have various forms of social media. I don't know any of the new music. I mean, as far as from the radio, but I know music from the type of media that I consume, whether it's television, whether it's, you know, the internet. You know, I'll hear a song, I don't know who sings it. You know, the Super Bowl was the other day, and I didn't realize I knew as many weekend songs as I did, and it was because of social media, because of TV and things like that. And that's what's going on, is they're creating their own culture, own songs, own language, own spellings of words, clothing, food, to where they're communicating with each other. And so they identify with each other more than they identify with the British. The British, to them, for some people, and I would just say the middle class and even below, they see the British as an oppressive people. What is your right to rule me other than that guy with a crown on his head?
Absolutely.
And for them, that was not rationale enough. It was simply, I'm an adult. I have the right to do this myself. But I'm of the school of thought that states that the revolution was not revolutionary. It had revolutionary aspects as far as changing the power structure, or at least transforming the power structure from the system that was there to having a defined set of laws, defined constitution, and also having your direct election of people, as opposed to a House of Lords, which was just nothing more than an aristocracy.
So really, when we talk about this revolution, we have this other question. What can you just put it out there for us? Let's acknowledge the big elephant in the room. What was the revolution really about? Give us the real deal. What was it really all about?
The American Revolution itself, when it comes down to it, it was just about who was in charge. And again, there are differing schools of thought on that. Some would say it's about, you know, pushing the Enlightenment principles and actually creating something new. But in reality, they didn't create anything new. These ideas were there. They were just the ones who were able to execute it. There are other countries that did it better. So the Haitians, when the Haitian Revolution took place, they had a complete cutoff. There was none of this idea of you're going to have French administrators or people who had been in the French government still part of this, or were part of the House of Burgesses, or part of the Continental Congress, are now going to go. It became a land reform. It became wealth reform. It became emancipation. There were a lot of things that were tied into it, because their revolution was about getting rid of that. Same thing with Brazil. The Brazilian Revolution, or independence, it was unique because the Pedro II had to go to Brazil to avoid the violence in Europe. So technically, Brazil was the head of the Portuguese crown.
Yep.
So when Brazil started fighting, and the king is there to see what's wrong with society, he's like, "We're okay, easy. I can solve this for you.
Yeah.
You have your independence." So you see where you get to have a. Okay, I'm on the thing. Thank you. Good night. She hears revolution. She's like, yes.
That's it. Right on.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Thank you. So even with the Mexican Revolution, you have it's a bottom up revolution initially. Right. So in 1810, you have oh my gosh, now I'm in trouble. Anyway, in 1810, a parish priest starts the revolution and actually gets Indian, mestizo, and black followers to push out Spanish rule. So when I say it, I'm a little jaded with the term revolution, because for the American Revolution, it's by basic definition, yes. But as far as the way it's implemented, no, because the same people who would have been in charge, the same type of people as far as that same level of society, who were already in charge because they were being sent to represent the people of their respective colonies to the Continental Congress or to their state houses, whether it's the House of Burgess or it has to be, or it's the governor or anything like that. It's those same people that are in those positions before the revolution and after the revolution.
Right. So I gotta acknowledge my sister, my dear sister in North Carolina, my sister, Dr. Pamela Bozeman, who mentions Pauline Maier, Dr. Maier, noted Declaration of Independence scholar. I'm sure you've probably come across much of, yeah. So, when we talk about this sacred document that many Americans, really cherish and are really serious about it, it says that all men, but I think the reality and what you've revealed to us this evening, all men does not really mean all men.
Right. Well, even then there's the definition as far as who counts as men. So their definition of man, and the thing is, language changes. Even if the intent that he has is, I'm speaking about men, I'm not including women in this. Because even when the country is formed, Abigail Adams goes to her husband, John Adams, and says, you better include women in this. Like, she specifically says, don't forget about the ladies. Like, we were there, we were, managing property, we were supplying troops, we were doing a lot of stuff for you. Mm-hmm. Don't forget about us. But language changes to where there is a little bit of fluidity where you can say, is it man as far as mankind, or is it man as in, hold on, let's say, you need to go to bed. Thank you. Go to bed. Thank you. I remember when I was 6. But was it man as far as mankind, or was it man as just men? Mm-hmm. And even with who are we talking about? So, because for someone like Thomas Jefferson, or even a good number of property holders themselves, those who just owned land versus those who owned land and human beings viewed that stuff as the same. They right. Viewed their property as their property. So why am I going to say all men are created equal? Now, I can say it as far as like this whole thing of, I believe in this principle and I will push forward to end this system. Or I'm pushing forward with this idea, but I just mean me. Now, we can read it as he just means white men. And even when it came to citizenship in the early years of the Republic, citizenship was only afforded to white men, men who were white, were 21 years of age, and owned property. So you had to qualify in those 4 areas to be considered a citizen. Women didn't count.
Right.
Black people didn't count. People didn't count. Indigenous people didn't count in many cases. I mean, depending at the state level, sometimes they included them. But at the time of the Declaration, I doubt, and there aren't too many people who would argue the other way, but I doubt that he meant anything other than white men of his station.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But the good thing is, and I'm one of those people that argues that the Declaration of Independence is a living document in the same way the Constitution is, because if we go back and look at these documents themselves, we are looking at where we are now based off of it and what we understand about society based off those documents. And it's no different than any other piece of literature where you look at it and you say, this character or this color or this whatever symbolizes this.
Right.
And one of the best examples I usually give for my students is The Wizard of Oz. Depending on the generation you live in or the generation you are, and when you see the film, that determines what you see each one of those members of the film, what Dorothy means, what the Tin Man means, what the Scarecrow, the Cowardly Lion means. So those 4 people, they meant something when the film was made. They meant something when the book was written. But for everyone who sees it, they're going to see something else.
Something else.
So I'm of the contemporary belief that all men are created equal means all men, all women, all genders, all races, all religions. So all people are created equal. It's just the opportunity that we get that's going to determine, what happens.
But isn't that what we are trying to become?
Yes.
It is not what we have always been. So, I mean, can we talk a little bit about, because this is why this is why this project exists. How can we get from the all men,
okay,
which really were, and you just said something interesting. So you said that he wrote this and made it applicable to men of his station.
So well, I'm saying that it could be argued that he made it for men of his station, as far as like those people. So I'm not worried about the indentured white servants that come over.
That's what I wanted to touch on. So can we say that men who did not, the overseer, let's just put it out there and call it for what it was not included in the all men?
I don't think
the overseer seen just as the slave?
Oh, no. I wouldn't see them as being equal to an enslaved person. What I'm saying, as far as the Jefferson himself is a complex figure. He's a dichotomy. Like he's an enigma wrapped in a mystery. Like there's so many things about him where at one moment he doesn't like it, but if it benefits him, he loves it. So he's the kind of person that if you walked up to him and told him like, oh, you can't have, or he would come up and tell you what you can't have and why. So I think with the interpretation, and this is always one of those things where you have some freedom to it, the interpretation of what he's putting into the Declaration itself, it's open because you can talk about him saying it's speaking to his peers, as opposed to he's not talking about enslaved people. He's probably not talking about indentured servants. He's probably not talking about indigenous folks. He's probably talking about just those white men who own property. Which, I mean, you had a significant amount, but those are the ones that I would say have a very vested interest in becoming an independent state. Because if you're already of means, you're already coming from a position of privilege, Your privilege increases when you get rid of a power structure that could limit your privilege,
Mm-hmm.
limit the power that you have. So I don't think he really saw, an indentured person as competition, or even, an overseer that he would have hired as competition. He saw them as a potential ally to have if he needed them. But, in a lot of cases, they're not the ones who are going to be getting those documents, and not going to be looking through the Enlightenment and rationalizing and saying, like, no, Thomas, when you said all men, I believe you meant me too. I
Right.
don't see them having those conversations. But again, he's a very complicated person, because he wrote some horrible things about race and about enslaved people. Yet he procreated and had at least 6 children by one forcibly.
Exactly. So, with all of this in that one breath that you just spoke, I'm thinking now, my sister Pamela has me really thinking about Dr. Mayer's work. Was Jefferson also a visionary, perhaps, that he knew that all men did not include literally all men, but perhaps where we are today, that would be the reality that he was foreseeing. Even if we want to be very spiritual about it, was he prophesying that this is the America that I envision? It's not happening now, and I'm a part of this system. But in the future, I see that all men really will be equal.
I think if it were Frederick Douglass, I would say yes. I without hesitation. If you said, would Frederick Douglass see it this way? Because he had that speech about what is the 4th of July to the Negro, when he's talking
Yeah.
about Independence Day in 1776. So he would make the argument that Jefferson probably wouldn't see it that way, or he might be confused somehow. Whereas Frederick Douglass would look at it and say, like, finally, some change has happened.
Right.
Meanwhile, someone of this time period, like, what do you mean? What change? This is going on, this is going on. But it's a drastic change from what he was used to. I don't know. I mean, there's some things that Jefferson wrote about governments, and that the United States itself was an experiment. This is the great American experiment. So not necessarily that he would prophesize about it, but I think he would find it interesting to see it, and kind of ask some questions like, how did we get from point A to point B? How did we get to this point? And he'd want to investigate it. But I don't know if, as far as him specifically pointing out, hey, this is definitely something I would have envisioned. I think it would have been more, he would see it and want to investigate how it got to that point. Not necessarily out of shock, just out of curiosity, scientific
right.
curiosity.
So, is Mr. Jefferson a statesman?
Yeah. I mean, he is this statesman of statesmen. I mean, he was a polyglot. Of course, I think the word is philologist. Anyway, he was a polyglot because he spoke English, French. Gosh, what else did he speak? I think he spoke some German. But he was interested in diplomacy. He was interested. He was the first Secretary of State. So he, in fact, that was one of the criticisms of him was, can we really trust him? Because he really likes the French a lot. He speaks French, and we should be making up and becoming friends with the British now that we're independent. But I think the downside to him, and this is kind of downside to anybody who's very diplomatic, is sometimes people don't trust you. They feel like you're always going to try and make people happy. And I think that is probably, him being a slave owner's side, I think that was a problem that was driving him to cut those pieces out of the Declaration of Independence. when he drafted it, and of course when he submitted it, and then it got voted down, because he was saying like, look, I get what you guys are saying, but I understand I'm going to cut it. I think it's cowardly to do it, but I'll do it. So I could definitely, I mean, I'm not going to run from that. He is a statesman, but I think he was too concerned with being a people pleaser in some cases. I mean, this guy, when he was president, he met people at the door of the White House and personally greeted people at the White House when he was president. Wow. And even when it came to Lewis and Clark, used that to gain support with people by getting all their notes and their letters and having them published and saying like, look, we're adventuring, we're doing great things in this country, and we're spreading out, and we're doing all these things that you will eventually be able to live. I mean, that would be something he would probably been a lot more comfortable predicting, is like people living on the West Coast of the United States. Like, see, I wasn't wrong with the Louisiana Purchase. I was right. And, he's a very interesting figure. And it's one of those things I wouldn't say I admire him, but I find some of the things that he did to be remarkable. But then there are some things that he did that just outright despicable.
Yeah. So do we say that he is a contradiction of himself?
Oh, he's a walking contradiction. He's a walking contradiction.
Yeah.
I mean, with the stuff that he wrote, the stuff that he said, his actions, the way that he complained about Washington and Adams when they were president, as far as like complaining about, openly complained to them. He didn't do things behind their back, but he complained about their policies. And then when it's time for him to be president, it was kind of like he did the same thing. And it was like, well, I'm president now. Of course, this makes sense. Of course, I should raise taxes. Of course, I should buy Louisiana, because one of his best statements, and I'm paraphrasing, when he was criticized about buying Louisiana, he stated, "There's nothing in the Constitution that says that I can't buy Louisiana." And people were saying, like, there's nothing, you're a strict constructionist, you believe in the Constitution. It doesn't say you can buy land. And he just flips it on him and says, there's nothing that says I can't buy it.
Right.
Here's $15 million.
And I know gosh, this hour and a half really flew by, but I have to ask you before we leave about the social contract.
Yes.
Can you give us some insight? I want to feel better about this social contract. Can you give, what reason would slavery not have been a topic or a focus on this, on or in this social contract?
Slavery, as in the slaves not being subject to the social contract?
Right.
Because slaves aren't citizens. Enslaved people aren't citizens, therefore, because they're property, they don't have rights. And that would be the argument. And even with you're going to make me pull out some court cases now. even with Dred Scott versus Sanford, Justice Taney says, Black people have no rights in which white people are bound to respect, and even dismisses the case because it's saying, like, you literally don't exist. You can't be in this court because you don't have the right to be in this court. So the social contract would not exist for enslaved persons because, well, several things. One, they're not seen as citizens. Two, the governing body that they would have is whoever their owner is. So if you were to run it that way, because it wouldn't be the state, in no way would it be the state, because they're not subject to the state except in certain conditions, and those conditions don't have to do with citizenship. But a very loose way that you could look at the social contract with the enslaved and those who enslaved them is the way in which slave uprisings take place. You've done X amount of violence to us. You violated us in so many ways, physically, sexually, psychologically, that you would have people who would rise up and burn the plantation down, kill. You have German Coast, you've got Denmark Vesey, you have Nat Turner's revolt. You have all these moments where somebody said, "This isn't right. Let's do something."
Mm-hmm.
Haiti, it's the same thing. They were getting some of that influential, not necessarily literature, but they were getting some of that influence from the philosophers and from the Enlightenment and from talking to people in different areas and realizing we don't have anything to lose. I mean,
Right.
like, our lives are not going to change. I mean, okay, we might get killed, but that's a punishment for, especially as we get into the 19th century. That's a punishment for being off the land without a pass. Just
Yes.
the idea that you fear I'm going to start a revolt. So you see me by myself with no pass. You can kill me because the law states that you can, because you suspect that I'm trying to do something.
And so here we are, what, about 42 years later? Where are we with the social contract now, 2021?
It still exists. I mean, I think the social contract itself is still one of those things that is timeless, because that's how we execute the social contract now, is through voting. I mean, the basic way is through voting. Myanmar, of course, they've got a military coup that they're dealing with. But you have violent coups that take place in throughout the world. But a social contract itself, if your rights are not being protected, or if there's an abuse of power, it simply becomes a thing of, we get enough, we petition the government, or we have enough people sign on to an online petition or something like that, and we confront them about whatever it is. It could just be the having a law revoked. I was trying to think about one that was going on in Phoenix that people actually showed up for to protest. But if it was, let's just say, the police departments decided they didn't want to wear body cams or something like that, and the community wants, because you have the general will that's involved in this, the community wants the police to wear body cams or patrol the neighborhoods or whatever, and they don't patrol the neighborhoods the way that they promised, or they decide that they're not going to wear body cams, then you have redress with the government, with the city council or the county board of supervisors, and you let them know what's wrong, and they change it. They don't change it. Hey, next election, we got a whole new brand of board of supervisors up there.
Right. So I could not close this broadcast on good conscience without, and this show definitely should be dedicated to Sister Sarah Hemings. Would you share some thoughts about Sister Sarah Hemings?
Well, Hemings herself, it's one of those painful parts of history that you wish people would finally face up to. And I think within the last 10 years, that's been one of those things. Because when Jefferson was confronted about it, when he was either running for president or he was currently president, but he was confronted with it, and there was it was a little blurb in a periodical, and it basically accused him of having sexual intercourse with an enslaved woman who was his wife's half sister. And he did what I guess the very political thing, the smartest political maneuver. He didn't respond to it. He didn't address it. He didn't write any letters complaining about it. But the reality is, what we need to not have happen anymore is to teach the Hemings Jefferson story as some romantic love affair, because that's not what it was. This was a woman who was owned by him, owned by his widow. I'm sorry, his wife, when she became a widow, and then became his property upon her passing. And she had no power in this relationship. She had no power to, even if it was a thing of like she was okay with what was taking place, she had no power to refuse. So I think what a lot of people, and this is one of the problems I have with with some of the ways that movies represent history. They get little pieces and little tidbits of, oh, well, he took her to France with him and did this. He was taking her to France because that was his property, and it was one of those things where he may have become obsessed with her. Like, I don't want her to go. Like, he didn't free her. He freed 7 enslaved people and kept 600, which included Hemmings and included their 6 children. So there's no way that this is romantic. At the best, this is a toxic relationship. And in all honesty, we're talking about sexual assault. We're talking about manipulation. We're talking about control. And the Jefferson family, through DNA testing, the Black Jefferson DNA testing, were finally given their rights and recognition as heirs to Thomas Jefferson. And when I was growing up, I still recall the Jefferson heirs were fighting it, saying like, oh, this never happened. He didn't have any Black children. He didn't have any children with this. In fact, the picture that I included was his grandson with the, I should have mentioned, it was Isaac Hemmings. It was his grandson. And excuse me. No, I'm sorry. It was his son. It was his son, not his grandson. Isaac Hemmings. And he was still owned by Thomas Jefferson at the time of Thomas Jefferson's death. So it's one of those things where the romanticism needs to be removed from it. It needs to be talked. It needs to be talked about. It needs to be addressed, as opposed to, hey, they fell in love, because that's teaching 2 things wrong. You're teaching the history wrong. And then 2, you're teaching relationships wrong. Because that is not the way it takes place and happens. So, I think she honestly, and the family itself, as far as her heirs, honestly need to have more recognition. And thankful, in the past 10 years, they've been getting a lot more recognition.
Yes.
So, it just becomes a thing of, maybe we get a movie about what the Hemmings family went through, or the Hemmings side went through, and how they eventually got to where they are now, as opposed to, just being erased out of history or becoming invisible.
Exactly. And so as we come to the end of this broadcast, we dedicate this particular segment to Sister Sarah Hemmings, because, and again, this is why we're doing this project, because we have got to begin to see history as it really is. And I think that we tend to kind of romanticize, or I think this is why we add a romance to this story, because it makes it more palatable,
Right.
and it takes away from what this story really is. And I mean, we didn't even mention the fact that Sister Hemmings, her father was also Mrs. Jefferson's father.
Yes.
So there's a little bit of that's a twisted story.
Yeah,
right?
and that's why I mentioned half sister with that, but I should have mentioned that. Yeah, it's the same.
Yeah.
They had the same father.
They had the same father, and so we do not get our narrative, or we do not make the changes that we need to make this new, because I'm all for a new Declaration of Independence, or I'm for, as you mentioned, envisioning that when I read that sacred document, all men really does mean women of all colors and ethnicities, all of our new now transgender beings, everyone, to really make this all men. We're going to have to go back and have these conversations. And so that is why we are here this evening. That is why I give you the highest respects, because you have made this your passion, and this is your focus, this is your purpose, this is your contribution to humankind, to bring or keep the spotlight on America's history and to make it shine for what it really is, where we have been and where we're going. Because
I
no,
think
go
probably the
ahead.
most important thing, and you touched on this, I mean, the document itself, and I saw one of the comments that was talking about, looking at documents in their own time, which I agree with. And I think when it comes to especially a historical document like this, a foundational document, is not just about what it said then, it's about us making that apply to us. It's about us making that apply to us. So even if it didn't say all those groups, all those people, all those things, right? It should now be about us owning it and making sure that we push that towards everyone else in our society. Like, you are well, and that's the great thing about the Constitution is you can add on to it, you can change, you can have all these amendments to it, to where it does become more inclusive than the Declaration of Independence did. Because even the grievances that they have when they're addressing them to the king, that's specific to them. But the things that they're talking about, how a government gets formed and why a government is legitimate, that is universal. That stays with this country from now until the end. That Constitution is going to be that thing where we make both documents live up to what we feel America is and should be. And it's just like, and I almost let you off without a James Baldwin quote.
Don't do it. Let it.
That's I got to keep the streak alive. And I'm just going to paraphrase him, but he has this statement about, I love America more than you, and because I love America, I have every right to criticize her. Every right.
That's
and
it.
I think that's what a lot of people need to understand, which is we need to be critical of these historical figures and these historical documents, so we can talk about what they meant in the time, but then also talk about how human beings, citizens themselves, have changed since that time and what we've done to be more inclusive. So the document itself may have been exclusive, but the country doesn't have to be. The Constitution doesn't have to be. The legal system that we have doesn't have to be. And one of the things is getting a lot of that stuff out of those documents now, out of the legislation that we have now that is still old remnants of things, or just and a lot of times that it takes other court cases to do that, challenges to laws, and my hope is that this country continues to be more inclusive, to the point where even if you are in a position of privilege, which I will argue I am in at this moment, that in comparison to someone else, if someone else is needing a hand up, I should be able to put my hand down to help them get up, as opposed to, no, man, this doesn't include you. This law doesn't include you. You got to fight for your own law. No, this law can include this person or this group of people. It just takes the initiative by people who are already protected by that law, protected by that system, to say this should include them, just as it includes me.
Right. And that is why I say it quite often. That is why we need accomplices. We're beyond needing allies at this point, because you and I, as people of African descent, we were raised in a region of the world, and by these, we're descendants of slaves. And so there's something about most of us that we recognize a moral and cultural obligation to extend that hand back, right? So, but we need the others who do not look like us, who have been on the other side of history, to help make this right, and to help us rewrite these sacred documents, or to add those amendments. And so that's why we need those accomplices. So thank you so much, Brother
Thank you for
Donald, for
having me.
being with us. I already know that we have plans for you. You will be back with some other
Oh,
presentations, and we really appreciate you. There have been so many thank yous to you, accolades to you, and about this amazing conversation. And so we are very grateful to you for being here this evening. And we're very grateful to our viewers who took the time out to give us this time and to be with us to learn how we can together rewrite these sacred documents. We can amend them. And that is first by setting the record straight, I think, and then we can move forward in truth, and in the sense of true community and brotherhood. So thank you, everyone, and please join us again. I think we will be back on Sunday, where we're continuing these conversations about our earlier presidents and their role in forming or framing this place that we call the United States of America. Until we see you again, be blessed, stay happy, stay healthy, take care. Go in peace.
Thank you.